there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. Today we bring you an interview with Hayo Reinders. Hayo is a professor in education at Unitec in New Zealand and director of a doctoral program at Anaheim University in the US. Hayo's main research interests include innovations in education, self-access and autonomous learning, and teacher education. He is also a passionate believer in out-of-class learning, a topic that is covered in this episode's interview. Hayo's work includes titles such as Facilitating Workshops, a resource book for lecturers and trainers written by Marilyn Lewis, Key Concepts in Language Acquisition with previous TEFLology interviewee Sean Lowen, and 2008's Learner and Trainer Autonomy, Concepts, Realities and Responses, co-edited with Terry Lamb. Matthew sat down with Hayo back in August of this year and discussed the changing models of both teaching and learning.
Mentioned before, it'll be very informal.
Yep.
I have a few
informal.
I have a few.
Do you want lewd jokes or not?
Professor Ellis was our first interviewee, where we had to put a little explicit tag.
Okay.
And I think that increased downloads. So.
Okay.
So feel free.
Fuck this podcast.
Exactly. There we go. That's all we need. We're done.
Thank you very much.
First of all, is it
Hayo
yeah. Reinders or Reinders?
Reinders, close enough. Yeah.
Reinders.
Reinders. Yeah, but you know I get called reindeers a lot.
Everybody there seems to call you Reinders.
Reindeer. Well, reindeers is very common.
Okay.
And then often hey ho.
Right.
You know,
okay.
Hey Joe, hey ho.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Okay. Right. We'll stick with.
I'm Father Christmas.
Okay, so we'll get straight into it.
Sure.
So
you said you mean it was already recording?
It is.
Oh
yeah,
my God.
Yeah. Just because.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm sitting here with Hayo Reinders, which is as close as I'll get. So first of all, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you for inviting me.
I should maybe mention to our listeners that we're right in the middle of a one-day conference that you are very much part of. So we really appreciate you giving us your time. Yeah. So basically, we'd like to start by asking you to kind of self-introduce yourself in terms of, maybe especially in terms of your kind of career as a teacher and teacher trainer.
Right, and how I got into this space.
Yeah.
Well, honestly, and I've said this before, and I've upset people by saying this, but I got into teaching because I disliked most of the experiences I had as a learner. Seriously, both in school and in the various languages that I learned outside school, in courses and private schools and so on. And I realized at one point that actually it didn't have to be that way. That I disliked it not just because I was a grumpy student or because of me, but because it wasn't actually giving me and a lot of other people what we wanted, what we needed. Mm-hmm. So it was a real strong dissatisfaction with teaching and formal learning that got me interested in the field. That and a love of languages.
Okay.
So my first area of interest in language teaching and so on was actually anything and everything to do with not teaching.
Okay.
So one-to-one language support, like private tutoring, which is different from classroom teaching, can be a lot more informal and so on. Self-access language learning, language advising, various kinds of online language support when that became kind of popular in the late 90s. So really anything as far away as possible from the classroom. Over time, I've kind of gone back and said, okay, what links can we make from the classroom to what happens outside the classroom, and how can we help teachers to make those links? So rather than teaching, moving to preparing learners for and supporting them in their ongoing learning, because I see those as two different and complementary jobs.
And in terms of your kind of more formal entry into the field?
Oh, right. Yeah, there's that too, isn't there? Well, I started off studying Arabic and Hebrew because I'd learned a number of European languages and I wanted something that offered a bit more of a challenge. And so I lived in Damascus and in Cairo and studied Hebrew at the same time, which was interesting. If you tell people in Syria that you're studying Hebrew, it raises a few eyebrows. And through the language study, I realized that actually what I would enjoy most is understanding how I and other people came to acquire other languages, and why some people, I mean, as you can observe, as anyone can observe, some people enjoy it more, some people are more efficient, more effective at it. Why is that? And that's why I became interested in applied linguistics and started studying that. Yeah, so that's why I studied applied linguistics. And then because of my interest in out-of-class language learning and technology, which to me are two things that kind of go hand in hand. So I'm not interested in technology per se. I'm not a programmer. I can read code, but I can't write it. I don't consider myself a technical person in that sense. But clearly it became clear very quickly in the 90s that the possibilities of especially the internet, especially the social aspect, which was largely lacking in the preceding kind of PC-based, computer games, that there was real opportunity there in finding out how to, and that suddenly the learning experience became life-wide, not just lifelong, because that development has been going on since the 60s or 70s, but also life-wide, which is a very interesting idea.
Okay, so you recently, I think, co-edited a book called Contemporary Computer-Assisted Language Learning.
Yeah.
So maybe if you could just talk a little bit about what was the maybe more traditional call, and what do you mean by contemporary call?
You've got these three phases that some people talk about with, essentially it's a move towards greater interactivity, greater social connections. What is really fascinating to me at the moment, and that might be the really contemporary computer-assisted language learning book that might be coming out in 2 or 3 years, is that now we're seeing, of course, with technologies like the Internet of Things, where connections are not just made between people, which is already great, but also now between people and physical spaces. So all the various technologies that are coming out, augmented reality, virtual reality, and also, of course, the embedding of network interoperability in everyday objects, which means that potentially any encounter can give you, is a resource, has affordances for you to learn. So suddenly, it's not just that you can connect to a teacher or download resources from a computer anywhere, which is already a great step forward in terms of not being limited to a particular space and time and a particular curriculum. But suddenly you can involve your physical self in the learning process as well, not just your cognitive or your social self, but actually your physical being. So that's going to be a really, really interesting development, I think, in the next 3 or 4 years.
So you're obviously now heavily involved in teacher training, that side of things, and presumably still teaching language to learners.
Or maybe not.
Or maybe not.
Or maybe not.
Okay.
Yeah. So the model of education that we have at the moment, of course, is relatively short. It has been with us for a relatively short period of time, the last couple of 100 years. There's no reason to suggest why other models can't work equally well. There were reasons why the current model worked well for the time that it did, but society is changing, technology is changing, the world is changing, so I think at the very least what we're going to see is that we're going to have a range of complementary learning and teaching models, and possibly at least the diminishing importance, I don't think the entire elimination, but certainly diminishing importance of the current models that we have, including in language education. I think the only reason why we're still training people the way that we do is because the people who are currently the seniors in the field didn't grow up with the world that is now being developed. So unfortunately, controversial quote alert, I think that most language teacher education programs at the moment are fairly useless.
Okay. Because there's too much emphasis on traditional classroom teaching?
Look, you're training people, useless might be a strong word, but you're training people for two things. You're training them to be able to get a job next week. Yeah. So clearly, at the moment, that means if you're interested in language teaching, a job in a language school or some kind of classroom-based system. But you're also training people, ideally, for the job 5 years from now, or at least to develop their ability to further then develop themselves to be ready for a job 5 years from now. That second part we're not doing. So I'm not saying that that everything that we learn is not helpful, but it's very limited. And what is really challenging at the moment is that what our field, education in general, and language education in particular, just doesn't see yet is that a whole range of different developments are starting to come together that previously you could easily dismiss as, oh, no, that's not good enough, or that's not there yet, or whatever. But now, suddenly, when these things merge, things like machine learning and natural language processing and various other technologies, big data, learning analytics, if you put all these things together, suddenly, not only does that greatly diminish the need to learn languages in the first place, so the need for traditional language teachers, sorry to say, but also it means that you need to really train current or future language teachers in understanding, not necessarily being able to produce, but at least consuming, critically be able to consume things like those kinds of technologies, and that's not happening at all. That's not happening at all. I mean, I started a presentation last week and I showed a slide and it had 4 terms on it. And I asked the audience, how many of you know these terms? And it was Bayesian networks, non-native forests, and a couple of others. Of course, nobody knew. I said, well, all of us will know what these things mean 3 or 4 years from now, because this is all directly from educational data mining. This is all directly from data-driven learning. It's got good things and bad things, but at the moment we can't critically consume it because we have no idea. So that's what I mean when I say that current programs are not useful enough because they just do part of the job. Yeah.
Switching tack a little bit just for now, and focusing on your role as a teacher trainer. Maybe notoriously, there are not many people who are training people to be teacher trainers. So I'm just wondering what sort of most informed your development as a teacher trainer.
Yeah, that's a good question actually, because where does it stop? Where is the teacher trainer? Right. Who guards the guards kind of thing. And I would suggest that most of us who are in this role really roll into it, because of a passion, more than through structured study of development, because there's more now, but there didn't used to be much. So I can't think of any explicit training I ever received in teacher training.
But just kind of reflecting on your development as a teacher trainer,
right?
Was it working alongside other techer trainers?
You mean my personal development in the ability to do that? Yeah, definitely. I mean, that is very much, and that's a good example actually of how a non-formal type of learning can be extremely useful. And in many cases is the only type of learning available, either because the discipline that you're looking at is so new that there is not yet an established curriculum or a group of people who can help you, or simply because there are ways in which it is more appropriate to learn through, for example, apprenticeship type models, which is quite common in for example, my own development. That idea of supervisor, mentee, or apprentice, and learning by observing, the critical friendly engagement with others, with seniors, people who've been there before. Nothing formal about that. You don't get a certificate at the end, but I would struggle to think of a much better way to do it.
Okay. So it sounds like maybe you wouldn't necessarily be in favor of making that something like that more formal.
It's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, nobody would be against good structure or great curriculum where you are trained to be a teacher trainer. I mean, who would possibly argue against that? On the other hand, it is kind of reflective of development across education, where everything is being being repackaged so that it can be measured and traced and tracked and so on. And there are just skills that are not easy or even impossible to break down into little units. So although I'm not against the idea of trying to build a curriculum or program or something for that purpose, I think you do have to be very careful, because there are many skills, including the ones that we teach our learners, not just our teachers, that are personal, subjective, that are not little units. And that's a danger that exists, especially, and I say that not because there's a huge risk in what you just asked, but the neoliberal influence on education does force us in all aspects of education to do just that. How can we quantify this? How can we certify this? How can we demonstrate and give evidence of? Well, nobody would say, I don't want evidence that my class is. Everybody, you can't be against that. But at the same time, there's a lot of baggage that comes with that.
Okay, thanks. You train both pre-service and in-service teachers? What's the kind of biggest difference in the approach you take?
My personal approach to supporting people, I mean, really, it's you try, or at least I try, I should say, to develop autonomy, whether it's language learners or teachers in training or whatever, as quickly as possible. So you try and, as quickly as possible, move to a state where the pre-service teachers are actually taught and are learning in the same way as the in-service teachers. So you wouldn't just talk about language teaching, get them to do stuff. You would, get them to observe each other, so that they actually then become practitioners, members of that community. So you pair them up with in-service teachers, and you would organize that kind of peer and opportunities for peer learning and so on. Initially, of course, if somebody doesn't have any grounding yet, clearly you need to provide some structure, but the aim is to move away from that fairly quickly so that people can build their own structure. But really, for the in-service teachers, the model is primarily one of mentoring more than anything. I don't think, you can, I suppose, but it's very limited what you can teach teachers who are already working. Because first of all, they don't listen because they're teachers.
You mentioned the idea of autonomy, and I think you've published articles maybe about this for learners and for teachers. To what extent do you think kind of considerations of cultural differences? Do you think it's important to consider those when trying to apply those kind of concepts?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is a discussion that's been going on for as long as the word autonomy has been used in language education. Is it a cultural concept? Is it a Western concept in particular? Does it apply in our situation? I think really, like most concepts, it is all about the implementation, the context in which you use, whether it's educational technology or a particular concept like learner autonomy or teacher autonomy. If you're saying, well, this is what it is and it cannot be anything else, well, it's not going to fit in every context around the world. So what you've seen in the last 10, 15 years is that different cultures, and by cultures I mean not just geographically, different cultures, but also different groups of people, different groups of teachers and so on, have appropriated and made concepts like autonomy their own and said, well, to us it means this. So the idea of operationalizing a concept is actually far more interesting than trying to define it, right? Because autonomy, of course, is linked to how people think, how people feel, whether or not they take charge or control over themselves and their futures and their destinies. That is not something objective and fixed and set. Because it's linked to people's lives, it's always emergent and dynamic.
Great, thanks. And just as a final question, you touched on some of these earlier maybe, but what sort of future developments in language learning are you most excited about?
Well, what I'm most excited about, I can see a glimmer of hope in that we will finally be free ourselves of the shackles of the language classroom. I do think that the language classroom offers potentially a very rich environment. I also think that in most cases around the world it doesn't do that. So there's the potential, but it doesn't, because the teachers are, unfortunately, a lot of language teachers are not very good for all sorts of reasons. Unfortunately, a lot lot of language teachers teach the language in another language, and that's still very, very common. Of course, as you know, as we know, there's still a lot of countries where even communicative language teaching hasn't even begun to be implemented, let alone task-based language teaching, project-based language teaching. So the most exciting thing to me is that all of that, suddenly you get like a bypass kind of thing. You know, like how in Africa a lot of countries skipped the whole PC computer thing, went straight to mobile phones and mobile banking and everything. That's, you know, they're actually ahead of many other countries now who are stuck with these legacy systems. What you see now is that in the next 4 years, another 2 billion people around the world are going to come online. Those are the same people for whom it's likely to be their first opportunity to get access to good quality education, right? Because they're those kinds of people who are poor. So that means that they suddenly can bypass a whole historical legacy of hierarchical, formal teaching methods in schools and all that, and go potentially straight to the source, or find resources such as teachers, native speakers, other learners, and so on, elsewhere, which, to my mind, links back to the idea of autonomy, because that is really the idea of freedom and being able to shape your own destiny, your own future. We're slowly starting to get the tools to make that happen. And 5-10 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, you could have easily said, digital divide and so on. Actually, I think now that is starting to work in favor of some countries where the technologies are becoming so cheap. Like in India, you've got the $4 smartphone, full color LCD screen, including a data subscription for $4. So even poor people in India now can suddenly get access to resources that previously were unavailable to them. So what is that going to mean for language education? What is that going to mean? We're not developing, nobody's developing anything for mobile learning. If you look on iTunes or Google Play, it's all the vocabulary quizzes, and a few little boring games. But nobody's developing a language learning curriculum for delivery on a mobile platform. Not really, right? Why not? If we've got 2 billion people coming online in the next 3 or 4 years, many of whom will want to study a language, like English or another language, what are we doing? So I think there's lots and lots of potential, lots of opportunities. I also think that as a field we're a little bit traditional, a little bit behind, and we're not taking up those opportunities.
Great. Okay.
What to do?
Thank you very much for your time.
I hope you don't have to transcribe all of that, because that's 1,000 words a minute, isn't it?
Yeah. That was great. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it. And we'd also like to say a huge thank you to Hayo Reinders for giving us his time. We'll be back with a regular episode soon, but in the meantime, please visit our website, TEFLology-podcast.com. Follow us on Twitter, @TEFLology. Send us an email at TEFLology@gmail.com, and rate or review us on iTunes.